The Highly Sensitive Person by Elaine N. Aron. This book explores the concept of sensory processing sensitivity, a trait present in about 15 to 20% of the population. Highly sensitive people, HSPs, have a deeper cognitive processing of physical, social, and emotional stimuli. They tend to be more aware of subtleties, easily overwhelmed by intense situations, and deeply moved by arts and nature. Aron explains the biological basis of this trait, its advantages, like intuition, creativity, empathy, and challenges, for instance, overstimulation, social difficulties. The book aims to help HSPs understand their trait and provide strategies for thriving, such as setting boundaries, self-care, and embracing their unique strengths. Overall, the book validates the experiences of HSPs and offers guidance on navigating life as a highly sensitive individual in an insensitive world. The facts about being highly sensitive. A wrong sense of being flawed. In this chapter, you will learn the basic facts about your trait and how it makes you different from others. You will also discover the rest of your inherited personality and have your eyes opened about your culture's view of you. But first, you should meet Kristen. She thought she was crazy. Kristen was the 23rd interview of my research on HSPs. She was an intelligent, clear-eyed college student, but soon into our interview her voice began to tremble. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "but I really signed up to see you because you're a psychologist and I had to talk to someone who could tell me." Her voice broke. "Am I crazy?" I studied her with sympathy. She was obviously feeling desperate, but nothing she had said so far had given me any sense of mental illness. But then, I was already listening differently to people like Kristen. She tried again, as if afraid to give me time to answer. "I feel so different, I always did. I don't mean I mean. My family was great. My childhood was almost idyllic until I had to go to school. Although Mom says I was always a grumpy baby." She took a breath. I said something reassuring, and she plunged on. "But in nursery school, I was afraid of everything. Even music time, when they would pass out the pots and pans to pound, I would put my hands over my ears and cry." She looked away, her eyes glistening with tears now, too. "In elementary school, I was always the teacher's pet. Yet they'd say I was spacey." Her spaciness prompted a distressing series of medical and psychological tests. First, for mental retardation. As a result, she was enrolled in a program for the gifted, which did not surprise me. Still, the message was, something is wrong with this child. Her hearing was tested. Normal. In 4th grade, she had a brain scan on the theory that her inwardness was due to petit mal seizures. Her brain was normal. The final diagnosis? She had trouble screening out stimuli, but the result was a child who believed she was defective. Special, but deeply misunderstood. The diagnosis was right as far as it went. HSPs do take in a lot, all the subtleties others miss. But what seems ordinary to others, like loud music or crowds, can be highly stimulating and thus stressful for HSPs. Most people ignore sirens, glaring lights, strange odors, clutter, and chaos. HSPs are disturbed by them. Most people's feet may be tired at the end of a day in a mall or a museum, but they're ready for more when you suggest an evening party. HSPs need solitude after such a day. They feel jangled, over-aroused. Most people walk into a room and perhaps notice the furniture, the people. That's about it. HSPs can be instantly aware, whether they wish to be or not, of the mood, the friendships and enmities, the freshness or staleness of the air, the personality of the one who arranged the flowers. If you are an HSP, however, it is hard to grasp that you have some remarkable ability. How do you compare inner experiences? Not easily. Mostly you notice that you seem unable to tolerate as much as other people. You forget that you belong to a group that has often demonstrated great creativity, insight, passion, and caring, all highly valued by society. We are a package deal, however. Our trait of sensitivity means we will also be cautious, inward, needing extra time alone. Because people without the trait, the majority, do not understand that, they see us as timid, shy, weak, or that greatest sin of all, unsociable. Fearing these labels, we try to be like others. But that leads to our becoming over-aroused and distressed. Then that gets us labeled neurotic or crazy, first by others, and then by ourselves. Kristen's dangerous year. Sooner or later, everyone encounters stressful life experiences, but HSPs react more to such stimulation. If you see this reaction as part of some basic flaw, you intensify the stress already present in any life crisis. Next, come feelings of hopelessness and worthlessness. Kristen, for example, had such a crisis the year she started college. She had attended a low-key private high school and had never been away from home. Suddenly, she was living among strangers, fighting in crowds for courses and books, and always overstimulated. Next, she fell in love, fast and hard, as HSPs can do. Shortly after, she went to Japan to meet her boyfriend's family, an event she already had good reason to fear. It was while she was in Japan that, in her words, she flipped out. Kristen had never thought of herself as an anxious person, but suddenly in Japan, she was overcome by fears and could not sleep. Then she became depressed. Frightened by her own emotions, her self-confidence plummeted. Her young boyfriend could not cope with her craziness and wanted to end the relationship. By then she had returned to school, but feared she was going to fail at that too. Kristen was on the edge. She looked up at me after sobbing out the last of her story. Then I heard about this research about being sensitive and I thought, could that be me? But it isn't, I know, is it? I told her that of course I could not be sure from such a brief conversation. But I believe that, yes, her sensitivity in combination with all these stresses might well explain her state of mind. And so I had the privilege of explaining Kristen to herself. An explanation obviously long overdue. Defining high sensitivity, 2 facts to remember. Fact 1. Everyone, HSP or not, feels best when neither too bored nor too aroused. An individual will perform best on any kind of task, whether engaging in a conversation or playing in the Super Bowl, if his or her nervous system is moderately alert and aroused. 2 lit, teally arousal, and 1 is dull, ineffective. To change that under-aroused physical state, we drink some coffee, turn on the radio, call a friend, strike up a conversation with a total stranger, change careers, anything. At the other extreme, too much arousal of the nervous system and anyone will become distressed, clumsy, and confused. We cannot think. The body is not coordinated. We feel out of control. Again, we have many ways to correct the situation. Sometimes we rest, or mentally shut down. Some of us drink alcohol or take a Valium. The best amount of arousal falls somewhere in the middle. That there is a need and desire for an optimal level of arousal is, in fact, one of the most solid findings of psychology. It is true for everyone, even infants. They hate to feel bored or overwhelmed. Fact 2. People differ considerably in how much their nervous system is aroused in the same situation, under the same stimulation. The difference is largely inherited and is very real and normal. In fact, it can be observed in all higher animals: mice, cats, dogs, horses, monkeys, humans. Within a species, the percentage that is very sensitive to stimulation is usually about the same, around 15 to 20%. Just as some within a species a little bigger in size than others. Some are a little more sensitive. In fact, through careful breeding of animals, mating the sensitive ones to each other can create a sensitive strain in just a few generations. In short, among inborn traits of temperament, this one creates the most dramatic observable differences. The good news and the not so good. What this difference in arousability means is that you notice levels of stimulation that go unobserved by others. This is Taya whether we are talking about subtle sounds, sights, or physical sensations like pain. It is not that your hearing, vision, or other senses are more acute, plenty of HSPs wear glasses. The difference seems to lie somewhere on the way to the brain or in the brain, in a more careful processing of information. We reflect more on everything. And we sort things into finer distinctions. Like those machines that grade fruit by size, we sort into 10 sizes, while others sort into 2 or 3. This greater awareness of the subtle tends to make you more intuitive, which simply means picking up and working through information in a semi-conscious or unconscious way. The result is that you often just know without realizing how. Furthermore, this deeper processing of subtle details causes you to consider the past or future more. You just know how things got to be the way they are or how they are going to turn out. This is that sixth sense people talk about. It can be wrong, of course, just as your eyes and ears can be wrong, but your intuition is right often enough that HSPs tend to be visionaries, highly intuitive artists or inventors, as well as more conscientious, cautious, and wise people. The downside of the trait shows up at more intense levels of stimulation. What is moderately arousing for most people is highly arousing for HSPs. What is highly arousing for most people causes an HSP to become very frazzled indeed, until they reach a shutdown point called transmarginal inhibition. Transmarginal inhibition was first discussed around the turn of the century by the Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov, who was convinced that the most basic inherited difference among people was how soon they reach this shutdown point, and that the quick to shut down have a fundamentally different type of nervous system. No one likes being over-aroused, HSP or not. A person feels out of control, and the whole body warns that it is in trouble. Over-arousal often means failing to perform at one's best. Of course, it can also mean danger. An extra dread of over-arousal may even be built into all of us. Since a newborn cannot run or fight or even recognize danger, it is best if it howls at anything new, anything arousing at all, so that grown-ups can come and rescue it. Like the fire department, we HSPs mostly respond to false alarms. But if our sensitivity saves a life even once, it is a trait that has a genetic payoff. So, yes, when our trait leads to over-arousal, it is a nuisance. But it is part of a package deal with many advantages. More about stimulation. Stimulation is anything that wakes up the nervous system, gets its attention, makes the nerves fire off another round of the lit TLE electrical charges that they carry. We usually think of stimulation as coming from outside, but of course it can come from our body, such as pain, muscle tension, hunger, thirst, or sexual feelings, or as memories, fantasies, thoughts, or plans. Stimulation can vary in intensity, like the loudness of a noise, or in duration. It can be more stimulating because it is novel, as when one is startled by a honk or shout, or in its complexity, as when one is at a party and hearing 4 conversations at once plus music. Often we can get used to stimulation. But sometimes we think we have and aren't being bothered, but suddenly feel exhausted and realize why. We have been putting up with something at a conscious level, while it was actually wearing us down. Even a moderate and familiar stimulation, like a day at work, can cause an HSP to need quiet by evening. At that point, One more small stimulation can be the last straw. Stimulation is even more complicated because the same stimulus can have different meanings for different people. A crowded shopping mall at Christmas time may remind one person of happy family shopping excursions and create a warm holiday spirit. But another person may have been forced to go shopping with others, tried to buy gifts without enough money, and no idea of what to purchase, had unhappy memories of past holidays, and so suffers intensely in malls at Christmas. One general rule is that when we have no control over stimulation, it is more upsetting, even more so if we feel we are someone's victim. While music played by ourselves may be pleasant, heard from the neighbor's stereo, it can be annoying, and if we have previously asked them to turn it down, it becomes a hostile invasion. This book may even increase your annoyance a bit as you begin to appreciate that you are a minority whose rights to have less stimulation are generally ignored. Obviously, it would help if we were enlightened and detached from all of these associations so that nothing could arouse us. No wonder so many HSPs become interested in spiritual paths. Is arousal really different from anxiety and fear? It is important not to confuse arousal with fear. Fear creates arousal, but so do many other emotions, including joy, curiosity, or anger. But we can also be over-aroused by semi-conscious thoughts or low levels of excitement that create no obvious emotion. Often we are not aware of what is arousing us, such as the newness of a situation or noise, or the many things our eyes are seeing. Actually, there are several ways to be aroused and still other ways to feel aroused, and they differ from time to time and person to person. Arousal may appear as blushing, trembling, heart pounding, hands shaking, foggy thinking, stomach churning, muscles tensing, and hands or other parts of the body perspiring. Often people in such situations are not aware of some or all of these reactions as they occur. On the other hand, some people say they feel aroused, but that arousal shows up very little in any of these ways. Still, the term does describe something that all these experiences and physical states share. Like the word stress, arousal is a word that really communicates something we all know about, even if that something varies a lot. And of course, stress is closely related to arousal. Our response to stress is to become aroused. Once we do notice arousal, we want to name it and know its source in order to recognize danger. And often we think that our arousal is due to fear. We do not realize that our heart may be pounding from the sheer effort of processing extra stimulation. Or other people assume we are afraid, given our obvious arousal, so we assume it too. Then, deciding we must be afraid, we become even more aroused. And we avoid the situation in the future when staying in it and getting used to it might have calmed us down. We will discuss again the importance of not confusing fear and arousal in Chapter 5. When we talk about shyness, your trait really does make you special. There are many fruits growing from the trait of sensitivity. Your mind works differently. Please remember that what follows is on the average. Nobody has all these traits. But compared to non-HSPs, most of us are better at spotting errors and avoiding making errors. Highly conscientious. Able to concentrate deeply. But we do best without distractions. Especially good at tasks requiring vigilance, accuracy, speed, and the detection of minor differences. Able to process material to deeper levels of what psychologists call semantic memory. Often thinking about our own thinking. Able to learn without being aware we have learned. Deeply affected by other people's moods and emotions. Of course, there are many exceptions, especially to our being conscientious. And we don't want to be self-righteous about this. Plenty of harm can be done in the name of trying to do good. Indeed, all of these fruits have their bruised spots. We are so skilled, but alas, when being watched, timed, or evaluated, we often cannot display our competence. Our deeper processing may make it seem that at first we are not catching on, but with time we understand and remember more than others. This may be why HSPs learn languages better, although arousal may make one less fluent than others when speaking. By the way, thinking more than others about our own thoughts is not self-centeredness. It means that if asked what's on our mind, we are less likely to mention being aware of the world around us, and more likely to mention our inner reflections or musings. But we are no less likely to mention thinking about other people. Our bodies are different too. Most of us have nervous systems that make us specialists in fine motor movements, good at holding still. Morning people, here there are many exceptions, more affected by stimulants like caffeine, unless we are very used to them. More right-brained, less linear, more creative in a synthesizing way. More sensitive to things in the air. Yes, that means more hay fever and skin rashes. Overall, again, our nervous systems seem designed to react to subtle experiences, which also makes us slower to recover when we must react to intense stimuli. But HSPs are not in a more aroused state all the time. We are not chronically aroused in day-to-day life or when asleep. We are just more aroused by new or prolonged stimulation. Being an HSP is not the same as being neurotic, that is, constantly anxious for no apparent reason. How to think about your differences. I hope that by now you are seeing your trait in positive terms, but I really suggest trying to view it as neutral. It becomes an advantage or disadvantage only when you enter a particular situation. Since the trait exists in all higher animals, it must have value in many circumstances. My hunch is that it survives in a certain percentage of all higher animals because it is useful to have at least a few around who are always watching for subtle signs. 15 to 20% seems about the right proportion to have always on the alert for danger, new foods, the needs of the young and sick, and the habits of other animals. Of course, it is also good to have quite a few in a group who are not so alert to all the dangers and consequences of every action. They will rush out without a whole lot of thought to explore every new thing or fight for the group or territory. Every society needs both. And maybe there is a need for more of the less sensitive because more of them tend to get killed. This is all speculation, of course. Another hunch of mine, however, is that the human race benefits more from HSPs than do other species. HSPs do more of that which makes humans different from other animals. We imagine possibilities. We humans, and HSPs especially, are acutely aware of the past and future. On top of that, if necessity is the mother of invention, HSPs must spend far more time trying to invent solutions to human problems just because they are more sensitive to hunger, cold, insecurity, exhaustion, and illness. Sometimes people with our trait are said to be less happy or less capable of happiness. Of course, we can seem unhappy and moody, at least to non-HSPs, because we spend so much time thinking about things like the meaning of life and death and how complicated everything is. Not black and white thoughts at all. Since most non-HSPs do not seem to enjoy thinking about such things, they assume we must be unhappy doing all that pondering. And we certainly don't get any happier having them tell us we are unhappy, by their definition of happy, and that we are a problem for them because we seem unhappy. All those accusations could make anyone unhappy. The point is best made by Aristotle, who supposedly asked, "Would you rather be a happy pig or an unhappy human?" HSPs prefer the good feeling of being very conscious, very human, even if what we are conscious of is not always cause for rejoicing. The point, however, is not that non-HSPs are pigs. I know someone is going to say, "I am trying to make an elite out of us." But that would last about 5 minutes with most HSPs, would soon feel guilty for feeling superior. I'm just out to encourage us enough to make more of us feel like equals. Heredity and environment. Some of you may be wondering if you really inherited this trait, especially if you remember a time when your sensitivity seemed to begin or greatly increase. In most cases, sensitivity is inherited. The evidence for this is strong, mainly from studies of identical twins who were raised apart but grew up behaving similarly, which always suggests that behavior is at least partly genetically determined. On the other hand, it is not always TME that both separated twins show the trait, even if they are identical. For example, each twin will also tend to develop a personality quite like the mother raising that twin, even though she is not the biological mother. The fact is, there are probably no inherited traits that cannot also be enhanced, decreased, or entirely produced or eliminated by enough of certain kinds of life experiences. For example, a child under stress at home or at school only needs to be born with a slight tendency to be sensitive, and he or she will withdraw. Which may explain why children who have older brothers and sisters are more likely to be HSPs, and that would have nothing to do with genes. Similarly, studies of baby monkeys traumatized by separation from their mothers have found that these monkeys in adulthood behave much like monkeys born innately sensitive. Circumstances can also force the trait to disappear. Many children born very sensitive are pushed hard by parents, schools, or friends to be bolder. Living in a noisy or crowded environment, growing up in a large family, or being made to be more physically active may sometimes reduce sensitivity, just as sensitive animals that are handled a great deal will sometimes lose some of their natural caution, at least with certain people or in specific situations. That the underlying trait is entirely gone, however, seems unlikely. What about you? It is difficult to know for any particular adult whether you inherited the trait or developed it during your life. The best evidence, though hardly perfect, is whether your parents remember you as sensitive from the time you were born. If it is easy to do so, ask them, or whoever was your caretaker, to tell you all about what you were like in the first 6 months of life. Probably you will learn more if you do not begin by asking if you were sensitive. Just ask what you were like as a baby. Often the stories about you will tell it all. After a while, ask about some typical signs of highly sensitive babies. Were you difficult about change? About being undressed and put into water at bath time? About trying new foods? About noise? Did you have colic often? Were you slow to fall asleep, hard to keep asleep, or a short sleeper, especially when you were overtired? Remember, if your parents had no experience with other babies, they may not have noticed anything unusual at that age because they had no one to compare you to. Also, given all the blaming of parents for their children's every difficulty, your parents may need to convince you and themselves that all was perfect in your childhood. If you want, you can reassure them that you know they did their best and that all babies pose a few problems, but that you wonder which problems you presented. You might also let them see the questionnaire at the front of this book. Ask them if they or anyone else in your family has this trait. Especially if you find relatives with it on both sides, the odds are very good your trait is inherited. But what if it wasn't or you aren't sure? It probably does not matter at all. What does is that it is your trait now. So do not struggle too long over the question. The next topic is far more important. Learning about our culture, what you don't realize will hurt you. You and I are learning to see our trait as a neutral thing. Useful in some situations, not in others, but our culture definitely does not see it, or any trait, as neutral. The anthropologist Margaret Mead explained it well. Although a culture's newborns will show a broad range of inherited temperaments, only a narrow band of these, a certain type, will be the ideal. The ideal personality is embodied in Mead's words in every thread of the social fabric. In the care of the young child, the games the children play, the songs the people sing, the political organization, the religious observance, the art, and the philosophy. Other traits are ignored, discouraged, or, if all else fails, ridiculed. What is the ideal in our culture? Movies, advertisements, the design of public spaces, all tell us we should be as tough as the Terminator, as stoic as Clint Eastwood, as outgoing as Goldie Hawn. We should be pleasantly stimulated by bright lights, noise, a gang of cheerful fellows hanging out in a bar. If we are feeling overwhelmed and sensitive, we can always take a painkiller. If you remember only one thing from this book, it should be the following research study. Xianyan Chen and Kenneth Rubin of the University of Waterloo in Ontario, Canada, and Yurong Sun of Shanghai Teachers University compared 480 school children in Shanghai to 296 in Canada to see what traits made children most popular. In China, shy and sensitive children were among those most chosen by others to be friends or playmates. In Mandarin, the word for shy or quiet means good or well-behaved. Sensitive can be translated as having understanding, a term of praise. In Canada, shy and sensitive children were among the least chosen. Chances are, this is the kind of attitude you faced growing up. Think about the impact on you of not being the ideal for your culture. It has to affect you not only how others have treated you, but how you have come to treat yourself. Shedding the majority's rule. 1. What was your parents' attitude toward your sensitivity? Did they want you to keep it or lose it? Did they think of it as an inconvenience, as shyness, unmanliness, cowardice, a sign of artistic ability, cute? What about your other relatives, your friends, your teachers? 2. Think about the media, especially in childhood. Who were your role models and idols? Did they seem like HSPs? Or were they people you now see you could never be like? 3. Consider your resulting attitude. How has it affected your career, romantic relationships, recreational activities, and friendships? 4. How are you as an HSP being treated now by the media? Think about positive and negative images of HSPs, which predominate. And note that when someone is a victim in a movie or book, he or she is often portrayed as by nature sensitive, vulnerable, over-aroused. This is good for dramatic effect, because the victim is visibly shaken and upset, but bad for HSPs, because victim comes to be equated with sensitivity. 5. Think about how HSPs have contributed to society. Look for examples you know personally or have read about. Abraham Lincoln is probably a place to start. 6. Think about your own contribution to society. Whatever you are doing, sculpting, raising children, studying physics, voting, you tend to reflect deeply on the issues, attend to the details, have a vision of the future, and attempt to be conscientious. Psychology's bias. Psychological research is gaining valuable insights about people, and much of this book is based on those findings. But psychology is not perfect. It can only reflect the biases of the culture from which it comes. I could give example after example of research in psychology that reflects a bias that people I call HSPs are less happy and less mentally healthy, even less creative and intelligent. The first two are definitely not true. However, I will save these examples for re-educating my colleagues. Just be careful about accepting labels for yourself, such as inhibited, introverted, or shy. As we move on, you'll understand why each of these labels you. In general, they miss the essence of the trait and give it a negative tone. For example, research has found that most people, quite wrongly, associate introversion with poor mental health. When HSPs identify with these labels, their confidence drops lower, and their arousal increases in situations in which people thus labeled are expected to be awkward. It helps to know that in cultures in which the trait is more valued, such as Japan, Sweden, and China, the research takes on a different tone. For example, Japanese psychologists seem to expect their sensitive subjects to perform better, and they do. When studying stress, Japanese psychologists see more flaws in the way that the non-sensitive cope. There is no point in blaming our culture's psychology or its well-meaning researchers, however. They are doing their best. Royal advisors and warrior kings. For better and worse, the world is increasingly under the control of aggressive cultures, those that like to look outward, to expand, to compete and win. This is because when cultures come in contact, the more aggressive ones naturally tend to take over. How did we get into this situation? For most of the world, it began on the steppes of Asia, where the Indo-European culture was born. Those horse-riding nomads survived by expanding their herds of horses and cattle, mainly by stealing the herds and lands of others. They entered Europe about 7,000 years ago, reaching the Middle East and South Asia a little later. Before their arrival, there was little or no warfare, slavery, monarchy, or domination of one class by another. The newcomers made serfs or slaves out of the people they found. The ones without horses built walled cities where there had been peaceful settlements and set out to expand into larger kingdoms or empires through war or trade. The most long-lasting, happy Indo-European cultures have 18. The highly sensitive person always used two classes to govern themselves, the warrior kings balanced by their royal or priestly advisors. And Indo-European cultures have done well for themselves. Half of the world speaks an Indo-European language, which means they cannot help but think in an Indo-European way. Expansion, freedom, and fame are good. Those are the values of the warrior kings. For aggressive societies to survive, however, they always need that priest-judge-advisor class as well. This class balances the kings and warriors, as the U.S. Supreme Court balances the President and his armed forces. It is a more thoughtful group, often acting to check the impulses of the warrior kings. Since the advisor class often proves right, its members are respected as counselors, historians, teachers, scholars, and the upholders of justice. They have the foresight, for example, to look out for the well-being of those common folks on whom the society depends, those who grow the food and raise the children. They warn against hasty wars and bad use of the land. In short, a strong royal advisor class insists on stopping and thinking. And it tries, I think with growing success in modern times, to direct the wonderful expansive energy of their society away from aggression and domination. Better to use that energy for creative inventions, exploration, and protection of the planet and the powerless. HSPs tend to fill that advisor role. We are the writers, historians, philosophers, judges, artists, researchers, theologians, therapists, teachers, parents, and plain conscientious citizens. What we bring to any of these roles is a tendency to think about all the possible effects of an idea. Often we have to make ourselves unpopular by stopping the majority from rushing ahead. Thus, to perform our role well, we have to feel very good about ourselves. We have to ignore all the messages from the warriors that we are not as good as they are. The warriors have their bold style, which has its value. But we too have our style and our own important contribution to make. The case of Charles. Charles was one of the few HSPs I interviewed who had known he was sensitive his whole life and always saw it as a good thing. His unusual childhood and its consequences are a fine demonstration of the importance of self-esteem and of the effect of one's culture. Charles is happily married for the second time and enjoys a well-paid and admirable academic career of service and scholarship. In his leisure time, he is a pianist of exceptional talent. and he has a deep sense that these gifts are more than sufficient to give meaning to his life. After hearing all of this at the outset of our interview, I was naturally curious about his background. Here is Charles's first memory. I always ask this in my interviews. Even if inaccurate, what is recalled usually sets the tone or provides the theme of the whole life. He is standing on a sidewalk at the back of a crowd that is admiring a window filed with Christmas decorations. He cries out, "Everyone away, I want to see." They laugh and let him come to the front. What confidence! This courage to speak up so boldly surely began at home. Charles's parents were delighted by his sensitivity. In their circle of friends, their artistic, intellectual subculture, sensitivity was associated with particular intelligence, good breeding, and fine tastes. Rather than being upset that he studied so much instead of playing games with other boys, his parents encouraged him to read even more. To them, Charles was the ideal son. With this background, Charles believed in himself. He knew he had absorbed excellent aesthetic tastes and moral values at an early age. He did not see himself as flawed in any way. He did eventually realize he was unusual, part of a minority, but his entire subculture was unusual, and it had taught him to see that subculture as superior, not inferior. He had always felt confident among strangers, even when he was enrolled in the best preparatory schools, followed by an Ivy League university, and then took a position as a professor. When I asked Charles if he saw any advantages of the trait, he had no trouble reciting many. For example, he was certain it contributed to his musical ability. It had also helped him deepen his self-awareness during several years of psychoanalysis. As for the disadvantages of the trait and his way of making peace with them, noise bothers him a great deal. So he lives in a quiet neighborhood, surrounding himself with lovely and subtle sounds, including a fountain in his backyard and good music. He has deep emotions that can lead to occasional depression, but he explores and resolves his feelings. He knows he takes things too hard, but tries to allow for that. His experience of over-arousal is mainly of an intense physical response, the aftermath of which can prevent him from sleeping. But usually he can handle it in the moment through self-control, by comporting myself a certain way. When matters at work overwhelm him, he leaves as soon as he is not needed and walks it out or plays the piano. He deliberately avoided a business career because of his sensitivity. When he was promoted to an academic position that stressed him too much, he changed positions as soon as he could. Charles has organized his life around his trait, maintaining an optimal level of arousal without feeling in any way flawed for doing so. When I asked, as I usually do, what advice he would give others, he said, "Spend enough time putting yourself out there in the world. Your sensitivity is not something to be feared." A reason for great pride. This first chapter may have been very stimulating. All sorts of strong, confusing feelings could be arising in you by now. I know from experience, however, that as you read and work through this book, those feelings will become increasingly clear and positive. To sum it up again, you pick up on the subtleties that others miss, and so naturally, you also arrive quickly at the level of arousal past which you are no longer comfortable. That first fact about you could not be true without the second being true as well. It's a package deal, and a very good package. It's also important that you keep in mind that this book is about both your personal innate physical trait and also about your frequently unappreciated social importance. You were born to be among the advisors and thinkers, the spiritual and moral leaders of your society. There is every reason for pride. At the end of some chapters, I will ask you to reframe your experiences in the light of what you now know. Reframing is a term from cognitive psychotherapy, which simply means seeing something in a new way, in a new context, with a new frame around it. Your first reframing task is to think about 3 major changes in your life that you remember well. HSPs usually respond to change with resistance. Or we try to throw ourselves into it, but we still suffer from it. We just don't do change well, even good changes. That can be the most maddening. When my novel was published and I had to go to England to promote it, I was finally living a fantasy I'd cherished for years. Of course, I got sick and hardly enjoyed a minute of the trip. At the time, I thought I must be neurotically robbing myself of my big moment. Now, understanding this trait, I see that the trip was just too exciting. My new understanding of that experience is exactly what I mean by reframing. So now it is your turn. Think of 3 major changes or surprises in your life. Choose one, a loss or ending that seemed bad at the time. Choose one that seems as if it should have been neutral, just a major change. And one that was good, something to celebrate or something done for you and meant to be kind. Now follow these steps for each. 1. Think about your response to the change and how you have always viewed it. Did you feel you responded wrong or not as others would have? Or for too long? Did you decide you were no good in some way? Did you try to hide your upset from others? Or did others find out and tell you that you were being too much? Here's an example of a negative change. Josh is 30 now, but for more than 20 years he has carried a sense of shame from when, in the middle of 3rd grade, he had to go to a new elementary school. He'd been well enough liked at his old school for his drawing ability, his sense of humor, his funny choices of clothes and such. At the new school, these same qualities made him the target of bullying and teasing. He acted as if he didn't care, but deep inside he felt awful. Even at 30, in the back of his mind he wondered if he hadn't deserved to be so unpopular. Maybe he really was odd and a weakling, or else why hadn't he defended himself better? Maybe it was all true. 2. Consider your response in the light of what you know now about how your body automatically operates. In the case of Josh, I would say that he was highly aroused during those first weeks at the new school. It must have been difficult to think up clever kid stuff to say, to succeed in the games and classroom tasks by which other children judge a new student. The bullies saw him as an easy target who could make them appear tougher. The others were afraid to defend him. He lost confidence and felt flawed, not likable. This intensified his arousal when he tried anything new while others were around. He could never seem relaxed and normal. It was a painful time, but nothing to be ashamed of. 3. Think if there's anything that needs to be done now. I especially recommend sharing your new view of the situation with someone else, provided they will appreciate it. Perhaps it could even be someone who was present at the time who could help you continue to fit details into the picture. I also advocate writing down your old and new views of the experience, and keeping them around for a while as a reminder. Chapter 2. Digging deeper, understanding your trait for all that it is. Now let's rearrange your mental furniture and make it impossible for you to doubt the reality of your trait. This is important, for the trait has been discussed so little in the field of psychology. We'll look at a case history as well as scientific evidence, most of it from studying children's temperaments, which makes it all the more fitting that the case history is a tale of 2 children. Observing Rob and Rebecca. About the time I began studying high sensitivity, a close friend gave birth to twins, a boy, Rob, and a girl, Rebecca. From the first day, one could sense a difference between them, and I understood exactly what it was. The scientist in me was delighted. Not only would I watch a highly sensitive child growing up, but Rob came with his own control group, or comparison, his sister Rebecca, born into exactly the same environment. A particular benefit of knowing Rob from birth was that it dispelled any doubts I had about the trait being inheritable. While it is true that he and his sister were also treated differently from the start, at first that was largely because of his sensitivity, a difference he brought into the world. Being different genders, Rob and Rebecca are fraternal twins, not identical, which means that their genes are no more similar than are those of any brothers and sisters. To add frosting to this psychologist's cake, the genders as associated with sensitivity were switched. The boy, Rob, was the sensitive one. The girl, Rebecca, was not. The stereotypes were also reversed in that Rob was smaller than Rebecca. As you read about Rob, don't be surprised if you experience an emotional response. The whole point of my description is that some of it may also apply to you. Thus, vague memories or feelings from before you can remember what the feelings were attached to may return. Be easy about such feelings. Just observe them. In fact, it might be helpful to write them down. It will be useful information as you read and work through the next few chapters. Sleep troubles. In the first few days after Rob and Rebecca were born, the differences in temperament were greatest when the infants were tired. Rebecca would fall asleep easily and not wake up, especially as a result of some change. Visitors travel, Rob would stay awake and cry, which would mean that mom or dad would have to walk, rock, sing, or pat him, trying to bring him to a peaceful state. With a slightly older sensitive child, current advice is to put the child to bed and let the quiet and dark gradually temper the overstimulation that is the true cause of the crying. HSPs know all about being too tired to sleep. They are actually too frazzled to sleep. Leaving a newborn to scream for an hour, however, is more than most parents can bear, probably because it is not really very wise to do so. A newborn is usually best soothed by motion. In Rob's case, his parents finally found that an electric swing induced sleep best. Then came the problem of his remaining asleep. There are always points in anyone's sleep cycle that make it very easy or difficult to be awakened, but sensitive children seem to have fewer periods of deep, imperturbable sleep. And once awake, they have greater difficulty going back to sleep. Remember, this was probably also true of you, whether you remember or not. My own solution with our highly sensitive child was to use blankets to cover his crib. In his little tent, all was quiet and cozy, especially if we were laying him down in an unfamiliar place. Sometimes sensitive children really force their parents to be both empathic and creative. One night, two kids, when Rob and Rebecca were almost 3, their little brother was born. My husband and I visited for the night and slept in the bed of their parents, who were at the hospital. We had been warned that Rob might wake up at least once, frightened by a bad dream. He had many more of them than his sister. HSPs often do. As expected, at 5 a.m, Rob wandered in, crying softly. When he saw the wrong people in his parents' bed, his sleepy moans became screams. I have no idea what his mind envisioned. Perhaps danger mother is gone, horrible beings have taken her place. Most parents agree that everything gets easier once a child can understand words. This is so much more true with a highly sensitive child, caught up in his own imagination. The trick was to slip some quick, soothing words of mine in between his sobs. Fortunately, Rob has a great sense of humor. So I reminded him of a recent evening when I had babysat and served the two of them cookies as appetizers before dinner. He gulped and stared, then smiled. And somewhere in his brain, I moved from the category of monster who has taken mother to silly Elaine. I asked him if he wanted to join us, but I knew he would choose his own bed. Soon he was back there, sleeping soundly. In the morning, Rebecca came in. When she saw that her parents were gone, she smiled and said, "Hi, Elaine, hi, Art," and walked out. That is the difference in the non-HSP. It is painful to imagine what would have happened if I had been the sort to have shouted at Rob to shut up and get back to bed. He probably would have done just that, feeling abandoned in a dangerous world. But he would not have slept. His intuitive mind would have elaborated on the experience for hours. including probably deciding he was somehow to blame. With sensitive children, physical blows or traumas aren't required to make them afraid of the dark. Rounding out our picture of Rob. By day, when the twins went out with their parents during that first year, the mariachi band at the Mexican restaurant fascinated Rebecca. It made Rob cry. In their second year, Rebecca was delighted by ocean waves, haircuts, and merry-go-rounds. Rob was afraid of them, at least at first, just as he was on the first day of nursery school, and with the stimulation accompanying each birthday and holiday. Furthermore, Rob developed fears of pine cones, of figures printed on his bedspread, of shadows on the wall. The fears were strange and unrealistic to us, but they were certainly real to him. In short, Rob's childhood has been a little difficult for him and for his caring, stable, competent parents. Actually, unfair as it is, the difficult aspects of any temperament are displayed more when the home environment is sound. Otherwise, in order to survive, an infant will do whatever he or she must to adapt to the caretakers, with temperament going underground to resurface in some other way later, perhaps in stress-related physical symptoms. But Rob is free to be who he is, so his sensitivity is out there for all to see. He can express his feelings, and as a result he can learn what does and does not work. For example, during his first 4 years when Rob was overwhelmed, he would often burst into angry tears. At these times his parents would patiently help him contain his feelings. And with every month he seemed better able to not become overwhelmed. When watching a movie with scary or sad sequences, for example, he learned to tell himself what his parents would say. It's just a movie, or, yeah, but I know it ends okay. Or he would close his eyes and cover his ears or leave the room for a little while. Probably because he is more cautious, he has been slower to learn some physical skills. With other boys, he is less comfortable with wilder, rougher play. But he wants to be like them and tries. So he is accepted. And thanks to careful attention to his adjustment, thus far he likes school a great deal. There are some other points about Rob that are not surprising, given his trait. He has an extraordinary imagination. He is drawn to everything artistic, especially music, true for many HSPs. He is funny and a great ham when he feels at home with his audience. Since he was 3, he has thought like a lawyer, quick to notice fine points and make subtle distinctions. He is concerned about the suffering of others and polite, kind, and considerate, except, perhaps, when he is overcome by too much stimulation. His sister, meanwhile, has her own numerous virtues. One is that she is a steady sort, the anchor in her brother's life. What makes Rob and Rebecca so very different from each other? What makes you answer yes to so many items on the self-test at the beginning of this book, when most people would not? You are truly a different breed. Jerome Kagan, a psychologist at Harvard, has devoted much of his career to the study of this trait. For him, it is as observable a difference as hair or eye color. Of course, he calls it other names: inhibitedness, shyness, or timidity in children, and I cannot agree with his terms. But I understand that from the outside, and especially in a laboratory setting, the children he studies do seem mainly inhibited, shy, or timid. Just remember as I discuss Kagan that sensitivity is the real trait, and that a child standing still and observing others may be quite inhibited inside in his or her processing of all the nuances of what is being seen. Kagan has been following the development of 22 children with the trait. He is also studying 19 who seem to be very uninhibited. According to their parents, as infants the inhibited children had had more allergies, insomnia, colic, and constipation than the average child. As young children, seen in the laboratory for the first time, their heartbeat rates are generally higher and under stress show less change. Heart rate can't change much if it is already high. Also, when under stress, their pupils dilate sooner and their vocal cords are more tense, making their voice change to a higher pitch. Many HSPs are relieved to know why their voice can become so strange sounding when they are aroused. The body fluids, blood, urine, saliva, of sensitive children show indications of high levels of norepinephrine present in their brains, especially after the children are exposed to various forms of stress in the laboratory. Norepinephrine is associated with arousal. In fact, it is the brain's version of adrenaline. Sensitive children's body fluids also contain more cortisol, both when under stress and when at home. Cortisol is the hormone present when one is in a more or less constant state of arousal or wariness. Remember cortisol? It comes up again. Kagan then studied infants to see which ones would grow into inhibited children. He found that about 20% of all babies are highly reactive when exposed to various stimuli. They pump and flex their limbs vigorously, arch their backs as if irritated or trying to get away, and frequently cry. A year later, 2/3 of the study's reactive babies were inhibited children and showed high levels of fear in new situations. Only 10% showed low levels. So, the trait is roughly observable from birth, as was the case with Rob. All of this suggests what I have already said, that sensitive children come with a built-in tendency to react more strongly to external stimuli. But Kagan and others are discovering the details that make that so. For example, Kagan found that babies who later showed this trait also had cooler foreheads on the right side of their head, which indicates greater activity on the right side of the brain. The blood is drawn away from the surface toward the activity. Other studies have also found that many HSPs have more activity in the right hemisphere of the brain, especially those who stay sensitive from birth into childhood. That is, were clearly born that way. Kagan's conclusion is that persons with the trait of sensitivity or inhibitedness are a special breed. They are genetically quite different, although still utterly human, just as bloodhounds and border collies are quite different, although both are still definitely dogs. My own research also points to the idea of a distinct genetic breed of sensitive people. In my telephone survey of 300 randomly selected people, I found both a distinct group and also a continuum. On a scale of 1 to 5, about 20% felt they were extremely or quite a bit sensitive. An additional 27% said moderately. Together, those three categories seemed like a continuum. But then, there was a sharp break. A measly 8% were not, and a whopping 42% said they were not at all sensitive, as if we were asking Laplanders about coconuts. My sense of HSPs from meeting them is that they are indeed a distinct group separate from the non-sensitive. Yet among them there is also a wide range in sensitivity. This may be due to there being several different causes of the trait leading to different kinds or flavors of sensitivity, some of them stronger than others, or to some people being born with 2 kinds, 3 kinds, and so on. And there are so many ways that humans can increase or decrease their sensitivity through experience or conscious choice. All of these effects could cause a blurring of the boundary of what is still basically a separate group. There is no denying the sense that Rob and Rebecca are 2 different sorts of humans. You are too. Your differences are very real. The brain's 2 systems. A number of researchers think that there are 2 systems in the brain, and that it is the balance of these 2 that creates sensitivity. One system, the behavioral activation, or approach or facilitation system, is hooked up to the parts of the brain that take in messages from the senses and send out orders to the limbs to get moving. This system is designed to move us toward things, especially new ones. It is probably meant to keep us eagerly searching for the good things in life, like fresh food and companionship, all of which we need for survival. When the activation system is operating, We are curious, bold, and impulsive. The other system is called the behavioral inhibition, or withdrawal or avoidance system. You can already tell by the names which is the good one according to our culture. This system is said to move us away from things, making us attentive to dangers. It makes us alert, cautious, and watchful for signs. Not surprisingly, this system is hooked up to all the parts of the brain Kagan, noted to be more active in his inhibited children. But what does this system really do? It takes in everything about a situation and then automatically compares the present to what has been normal and usual in the past and what should be expected in the future. If there is a mismatch, the system makes us stop and wait until we understand the new circumstance. To me, this is a very significant part of being intelligent. So I prefer to give it a more positive name, the automatic pause to check system. But now consider how one might have a more active pause to check system. Imagine Rob and Rebecca coming to school one morning. Rebecca sees the same classroom, teacher, and children as were there yesterday. She runs off to play. Rob notices that the teacher is in a bad mood, one of the children is looking angry, and some bags are in the corner that were not there before. Rob hesitates and may decide that there is reason for caution. So sensitivity, the subtle processing of sensory information, is the real difference once again. Notice how psychology has described the two systems as having opposing purposes. How like the opposition I described in the last chapter between the warrior king class and the royal advisor class. This two-system explanation of sensitivity also suggests two different types of HSPs. Some might have only an average strength pause to check system, but an activation system that is even weaker. This kind of HSP might be very calm, quiet, and content with a simple life. It's as if the royal advisors are monks who rule the whole country/person. Another kind of HSP could potentially have an even stronger pause to check system, but an activation system that is also very strong, just not quite as strong. This kind of HSP would be both very curious and very cautious, bold yet anxious, easily bored yet easily over-aroused. The optimal level of arousal is a narrow range. One could say there is a constant power struggle between the advisor and the impulsive, expansive warrior within the person. I think Rob is this type. Other young children, however, are described as so quiet and uncurious that they are in danger of being ignored and neglected. What type are you? Does your pause to check/advisor system rule alone, thanks to a quiet activator/warrior king system? That is it easy for you to be content with a quiet life? Or are the two branches that govern you in constant conflict? That is, do you always want to be trying new things even if you know that afterward you will be exhausted? You are more than genes and systems. Let's not forget that you are a complicated being. Certain investigators, such as Mary Rothbard of the University of Oregon, are adamant that temperament is quite a different matter when you study adult humans, who can reason, make choices, and exert willpower to follow through on their choices. Rothbard believes that if psychologists study children and animals too much, they will overlook the role of human thinking and a lifetime's experience. Let's go over your development and Rob's as Rothbard sees it, and how being sensitive would differ at each stage. At birth, an infant's only reaction is negative, irritability, discomfort. Sensitive babies like you and Rob were mainly differ, and in being more irritable and uncomfortable. What Kagan called highly reactive. At about 2 months, the behavioral activation system becomes functional. Now you showed an interest in new things in case they might satisfy your needs. Along with that came a new feeling, anger and frustration when you did not get what you wanted. So positive emotions and anger were possible, and how much you felt them depended on the strength of your activation system. Rob, having both systems strong, became an easily angered baby. But sensitive babies with a low activation system would be placid and good at this age. At 6 months, your superior automatic pause to check system came online. You could compare present experiences with those of the past, and if the present ones were upsetting as those in the past, you would experience fear. But again, you saw more subtle differences in each experience. For you, there was more that was unfamiliar and possibly frightening. At this point, 6 months, every experience becomes very important for HSPs. One can see how a few bad experiences, when approaching new things, could turn the pause to check system into a pause and do nothing system, a true inhibition system. The best way to avoid bad things would seem to be avoiding everything. And of course, the more the world is avoided, the newer everything will seem. Imagine how frightening the world could have seemed to you. Finally, around 10 months, you began to develop the ability to shift your attention, to decide how to experience something or to stop a behavior. Only at this point could you start to handle conflicts between the two systems. A conflict would be want to try that, but it seems so strange. At 10 months we might not use those words, but that would be the idea. But now you could make some choices about which emotion to obey. One could almost see Rob doing it. Okay, it's unfamiliar, but I'll go ahead anyway. You probably had favorite methods of overriding the pause to check system if it slowed you too long or often. One way might have been to imitate those with less of it. You just went ahead and got some good things too, like them, in spite of your caution. Another might have been the recategorizing of the stimulation to make it familiar. The growling wolf in the movie is just a big dog, but most of your help probably came from others who wanted you to feel safe, not afraid. Social help with fears involves yet another system that Rothbard believes is highly developed in adult humans. It also arrives at about 10 months. With it, a child begins to connect with others, to enjoy them. If these social experiences are positive and supportive, another physiological system develops for which humans are biologically prepared. One could call this the loving system. It creates endorphins, the good-feeling neurochemicals. How much could you overcome your fears by trusting others to help? Who was around whom you could rely on? Did you act as if mother is here so I'll try? Did you learn to imitate her calming words and deeds, applying them to yourself? Don't be afraid, it'll be okay. I have seen Rob using all of these methods. Now you might spend a moment thinking about yourself and your childhood. And we will do more of this in the next 2 chapters. I know you don't really remember, but judging from what facts you have, what was that first year probably like? How does your thinking and self-control affect your sensitivity now? Are there times when you can control your arousal? Who taught you to do so? Who are your role models? Do you think you were taught to control your cautiousness too much so that you dared to do more than your body can handle? Or does it seem that your lesson was that the world is unsafe and over, arousal is uncontrollable? How trust becomes mistrust and the unfamiliar becomes dangerous. Most researchers on temperament have studied short-term arousal. It's easy to study, for it's quite apparent from the higher levels of heartbeat, respiration, perspiration, pupil dilation, and adrenaline. There is another system of arousal, however, that is governed more by hormones. It goes into action just as quickly, but the effect of its main product, cortisol, is most noticeable after 10 to 20 minutes. An important point is that when cortisol is present, the short-term arousal response is also even more likely. That is, this long-term type of arousal makes us even more excitable, more sensitive than before. Most of the effects of cortisol occur over hours or even days. They are mainly measured in the blood, saliva, or urine, so studying long-term arousal is less convenient. But psychologist Megan Gunnar of the University of Minnesota thought that the whole point of the pause-to-check system might be to protect the individual from this unhealthy, unpleasant, long-term arousal. Research shows that when people first encounter something new and potentially threatening, the short-term response always comes first. Meanwhile, we start to consider our resources. What are our abilities? What have we learned about this sort of situation from past experiences? Who is around who might help out? If we think we or those with us can cope with the situation, we stop seeing it as a threat. The short-term alert dies out, and the long-term alarm never goes off. Gunnar demonstrated this process in an interesting experiment. She set up a threatening situation much like those Kagan uses to identify inhibited children. But first, the 9-month-old babies were separated from their mothers for a half hour. Half were left with a very attentive babysitter who responded to all of the child's moods. The other half were left with a babysitter who was inattentive and unresponsive, unless the child actually fussed or cried. Next, while alone with the babysitter, each 9-month-old was exposed to something startlingly new. What is so important here is that only the highly sensitive babies with the inattentive babysitters showed more cortisol in their saliva. It was as if those with the attentive sitter felt they had a resource and had no need to make a long-term stress response. Suppose the caretaker is your own mother. Psychologists observing babies with their mothers have discovered certain signs that tell them if a child feels securely attached. A secure child feels safe to explore, and new experiences are not usually seen as a threat. Other signs indicate that a child is insecurely attached. The mothers of these children are either too protective or too neglectful or even dangerous. We will discuss attachment more in chapters 3 and 4. Research on sensitive children facing a novel, startling situation in the company of their mothers has found that these children do show their usual strong short-term response. But if a sensitive child is securely attached to mom, there is no long-term cortisol effect from this stress. Without secure attachment, however, a startling experience instead will produce long-term arousal. One can see why it is important that young HSPs and older ones too stay out in the world trying things rather than retreating, but their feelings about their caretakers have to be secure, and their experiences have to be successful, or their reasons not to approach will only be proved true, and all of this gets started before you can even talk. Many intelligent, sensitive parents provide all the needed experiences almost automatically. Rob's parents are constantly praising his successes and encouraging him to test his fears to see if they are realistic, while offering help if he needs it. With time, his idea of the world will be that it is not as frightening as his nervous system was telling him it was. During that first year or two, his creative traits and intuitive abilities, all the advantages of being sensitive, will flourish. The difficult areas will fade. When parents do nothing special to help a sensitive child feel safe, whether the child becomes truly inhibited probably depends on the relative strength of the activation and pause-to-check systems. But remember that some parents and environments can make matters much worse. Certainly, repeated frightening experiences will strongly reinforce caution, especially experiences of failing to be calmed or help, of being punished for active exploring, and of having others who should be helpful become dangerous instead. Another important point is that the more cortisol in an infant's body, the less the child will sleep, and the less sleep, the more cortisol. In the daytime, the more cortisol, the more fear, the more fear, the more cortisol. Uninterrupted sleep at night and timely naps all reduce cortisol in infants. And remember, lower cortisol also means fewer short-term alarms. It was easy to see that this was a constant problem with Rob. It may have been for you, too. Furthermore, if sleep problems beginning in infancy are not controlled, they may last into adulthood and make a highly sensitive person almost unbearably sensitive. So, get your sleep. Into the depths, there is another aspect of your trait that is harder to capture in studies or observations. Except when strange fears and nightmares visit the sensitive child or adult. To understand this very real aspect of the trait, one leaves the laboratory and enters the consulting room of the depth psychologist. Depth psychologists place great emphasis on the unconscious and the experiences embedded there, repressed or simply preverbal, that continue to govern our adult life. It is not surprising that highly sensitive children, and adults too, have a hard time with sleep and report more vivid, alarming, archetypal dreams. With the coming of darkness, subtle sounds and shapes begin to rule the imagination, and HSPs sense them more. There are also the unfamiliar experiences of the day, some only half noticed, some totally repressed. All of them swirl in the mind just as we are relaxing the conscious mind so that we can fall asleep. Falling asleep, staying asleep, and going back to sleep when awakened require an ability to soothe oneself, to feel safe in the world. The only depth psychologist to write explicitly about sensitivity was one of the founders of depth work, Carl Jung, and what he said was important, and exceptionally positive, for a change. Way back when psychotherapy began with Sigmund Freud, there was controversy about how much innate temperament shaped personality, including emotional problems. Before Freud, the medical establishment had emphasized inherited constitutional differences. Freud tried to prove that neurosis, his specialty, was caused by traumas, especially upsetting sexual experiences. Carl Jung, Freud's follower for a long time, split with him finally on the issue of the centrality of sexuality. Jung decided that the fundamental difference was an inherited greater sensitivity. He believed that when highly sensitive patients had experienced a trauma, sexual or otherwise, they had been unusually affected and so developed a neurosis. Note that Jung was saying that sensitive people not traumatized in childhood are not inherently neurotic. One thinks of Gunnar's finding that the sensitive child with a secure attachment to his or her mother does not feel threatened by new experiences. Indeed, Jung thought very highly of sensitive people, but then he was one himself. That Jung wrote about HSPs is a little-known fact. I did not know this when I began my work on the trait. For example, he said that a certain innate sensitiveness produces a special prehistory, a special way of experiencing infantile events, and that events bound up with powerful impressions can never pass off without leaving some trace on sensitive people. Later, Jung began to describe introverted and intuitive types in similar ways, but even more positively. He said they had to be more self-protective, what he meant by being introverted. But he also said that they were educators and promoters of culture. Their life teaches the other possibility, the interior life which is so painfully wanting in our civilization. Such people, Jung said, are naturally more influenced by their unconscious, which gives them information of the utmost importance, a prophetic foresight. To Jung, the unconscious contains important wisdom to be learned. A life lived in deep communication with the unconscious is far more influential and personally satisfying. But such a life is also potentially more difficult, especially if in childhood there were too many disturbing experiences without a secure attachment. As you saw from Gunnar's research, and as you will see in Chapter 8, Jung was exactly right. So it's real and it's okay. Rob, Jerome Kagan, Megan Gunnar, and Carl Jung should have you well convinced now that your trait is utterly real. You are different. In the next chapter, you will consider how you may need to live differently from others if you are going to be in healthy harmony with your quite different, highly sensitive body. By now, you may be seeing a somewhat dark picture too, one of fear, timidity, inhibitedness, and distressed over-arousal. Only Jung spoke of the trait's advantages. But even then, it was in terms of our connection to the depths and darkness of the psyche. But remember that this sort of negativity is, once again, largely a sign of our culture's bias. Preferring toughness, the culture sees our trait as something difficult to live with, something to be cured. Do not forget that HSPs differ mainly in their sensitive processing of subtle stimuli. This is your most basic quality. That is a positive and accurate way to understand your trait. Working with what you have learned, your deeper response, this is something to do right now, just as you have finished reading this chapter. Your intellect has taken in some ideas, but your emotions may be having some deeper reactions to what you have been reading. To reach these deeper reactions, you need to reach the deeper parts of the body, of your emotions, of the more fundamental instinctual sort of consciousness that Jung called the unconscious. This is where the ignored or forgotten parts of yourself dwell, areas that may be threatened or relieved or excited or saddened by what you are learning. Read all of what is here, then proceed. Begin by breathing very consciously from the center of your body, from your abdomen. Make certain that your diaphragm stays involved. At first, blow out through your mouth fairly hard, as if blowing up a balloon. Your belly will tighten as you do this. Then, when you inhale, the breath will be taken in from the level of your stomach, very automatically. Your breathing in should be automatic and easy. Only your breathing out should be extended. That, too, can become less forceful and no longer out through your mouth once you are settled into breathing from your center, your belly, and not from high up in your chest. Once settled, you need to create a safe space within your imagination where anything at all is welcome. Invite any feeling to enter awareness there. It might be a bodily feeling, an ache in the back, a tension in your throat, an unsettled stomach. Let the sensation grow, and let it tell you what it is there to show you. You also might see a fleeting image, or hear a voice, or observe an emotion, or a series of these. A physical feeling might become an image, or a voice might express an emotion you begin to feel. Notice all that you can in this quiet state. If feelings need to be expressed, if you need to laugh, cry, or rage, try to let yourself do that a little. Then, as you emerge from that state, think about what happened. Note what stirred the feelings you had, what it was in what you read, what it was in what you thought or remembered while you read. How were your feelings related to being sensitive? Afterward, put into words some of what you have learned. Think about it for yourself, tell someone else, or write it down. Indeed, keeping a journal of your feelings while you read this book will be very helpful.